this evening's event, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Rasmus, who's the head of research at the Reuters Institute at Oxford University. And I mean, this is, I've never experienced a period like this for journalism. I've been in the game since 1972. I like to joke that it was when dinosaurs roamed the earth. I mean, I look back to these days, it was black and white, and you'd no mobile phone, no internet, no anything. And I'm a very great follower of all your research. I think it's fantastic. It's very cutting edge. And this is working for AFP. You know, Reuters is supposed to be a competition, but no, I think they do fantastic work. I post your research on Facebook and Twitter, so we're very honoured at the FCC to have you tonight. And I'm very interested to hear your view on what's in front of us, and particularly I think in Asia, because, you know, one thing, you know, my job in AFP at the moment, I'm in the news management, and we look a lot of course, at social media, fake news, all the rest of it. A lot of it comes out of Europe and the United States. Of course, the Trump phenomenon dominates it, but there's not that much really from Asia. You know, there's not a lot of think tanks or research into what's going on in Asia. So, and I met Claire Wardle, who you know well, who's the head of the First Draft News Coalition this morning, they came to Asia they do a lot of research into fake news and digital technology, social media, and there's a real lack of that in Asia at the moment. There's fake news in Asia. You would think only fake news came out of America, but there's fake news in Myanmar, there's fake news in Jakarta, there's a lot of fake news in the Philippines. So there's a big issue in Asia with the whole transformation in the media that is not really being written about, I think, or researched. So I think, Rasmus, you've been looking at this as well, so looking forward to what you've got to say about it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the kind introduction. Just a brief word about who we are and what we do before I say a few things on the topic of the evening, of the future of news. The Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism is a research institute at the University of Oxford. We were founded in 2006 with generous support from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, so from the nonprofit arm of the company, hence the name. It builds on an older fellowship program for mid-career journalists who come and spend between 6 months and a year with us in Oxford. We have journalists from all over the world. We've had about 600 journalists in the last 30 plus years from more than 100 countries. So it is a truly international community of journalists, indeed including many brilliant journalists here from Hong Kong, some of whom we have the pleasure of having dinner with later tonight, alumni, but also from many other parts of this region and the rest of the world, from mainland China, from India, from Pakistan, as well as from Europe and the Americas. I have the pleasure of running the research side of the Institute, which we have in addition to the fellowship program for journalists, where we try to take the best parts of the academic world, if you will, of the scientific work, the rigor, the independence, the commitment to evidence and to collegial review and discussion, but also bring to it a bit of a set of sort of journalistic sensibilities, if you will, in the sense that we are very committed to the idea of doing research that is timely and relevant for people like yourself who are doing something really difficult in a very uncertain and changing environment. So we really aim that our research is relevant for practicing journalists as well as for editors and media executives all over the world. One of the things we do every year is a big study of how news media use is changing. We like to say all over the world. That's not quite true, but we do cover 36 markets in the survey we've just put into the field in 2017. So sort of 2.5 billion people or so. So we feel we are making progress. And for those of you who are interested in samples of that research, I invite you to, as you leave, think about whether you want to pick up one of the copies that are at the back of the room, free copies of the report we did last year based on this survey, and the new report will come out in the summer. So with that little promotional pitch for those who are interested, really, I'll say just a few things about the future of journalism as I see it on the basis of our research and our experience. And I will just preface it by one thing, which is to say, I know that the room today is full of people with many different backgrounds and from many different countries and many different experiences. And I want to underline very much that nothing I'm going to say tonight will claim to represent all of your experiences or every country. There are very important differences from company to company, from broadcast to print legacy to online only, from different beats, whether you are in business or whether you are in sport or culture or domestic politics. But I think we can, despite those differences and across those differences by beat, by company, by country, also see some patterns in where journalism is heading. And some of those patterns are particularly clear in highly developed markets, including markets like Hong Kong, where I think, in fact, some of these developments may be ahead of developments in many countries in Europe, because Hong Kong is a very technologically advanced market. It's a very affluent market. So I will talk about some of those key commonalities. I will talk primarily about the professional sort of content production and the business and distribution of journalism. And the reason I say that is that there is a whole separate set of issues that are about the relationship between journalism and the state and civil society and political actors. In some countries like Mexico, it's even organized crime and the like. And these are obviously incredibly central to the day-to-day work of many journalists, whether this is in the form of people who sort of help you do your reporting, or whether it's in the form of people who make it very difficult for you to do your reporting, whether those are political actors or governments or organized crime, as said, or even religious organizations or the like, which is a real issue in many markets. So I'm not going to talk about those. I'm just sort of recognizing that those are very important issues that are central to much of what many of you do. I will talk instead about the profession and the business that underpins it. The first thing I want to say, and this I think is sometimes a little bit controversial in a context where I think many of you will have experienced quite wrenching changes in the organization that you work for in terms of the business, its ability to invest in content production, and sometimes also in what you perceive as the quality of much of the content that is produced by professional journalists. I'm going to put this to you. I think the best journalism today is probably better than it's ever been. I don't mean to say that all journalism is better than it's ever been. It's very clear that there is a lot of frothy and quite superficial and poorly sourced stuff that's being published. It's always been the case, but there's probably even more of it today because it's very easy and cheap to publish. But I would put to you that the best journalism today is better than it's ever been. If you think about, for example, something like the Paris Climate Summit, those of you who are old enough to remember it, think about this. Think about the difference between the Kyoto negotiations on the UN Climate Protocol versus the Paris Climate Summit. I think it is very hard to make the case that we were better informed about the Kyoto negotiations than we were about Paris. I think the detail of coverage, the diversity of perspectives, the richness and depth of that coverage, the way in which journalists at the best organizations could link to sources and research and evidence and voices that supported their journalism, sometimes links to things that challenged their journalism but helped give the reader a better basis for making sense of whether they were convinced by the interpretation and the facts brought to bear by the journalist, was much richer than anything that was possible in the 90s, even though many newsrooms are smaller. The content itself can, in some cases, at least in the best cases, be richer and better. And this is not an only example. I mean, you can think of, say, something like the Washington Post's secret America investigation into the intelligence agencies, the New York Times documenting of the so-called Islamic State and its activities in the Middle East. There are many examples. I'm just using a few that I'm familiar with from the English language world, but these are not confined to the English language world. Bild in Germany, mostly known for quite sensationalist tabloid journalism, has done incredible things, sending a single reporter following refugees all the way from Syria through Turkey, through the Balkans, all the way to Germany, filming some of this with 360 videos. Virtual reality was shot around this. It's incredible storytelling. It's incredible witnessing of really important stories. That would have been prohibitively expensive 20 years ago. So the best journalism today, I think, from many points of views, is much better than it's ever been. So this is, if you will, my starting point. I mean, think about your own morning. Think about the diversity of sources you've had access to. I was born in 1980, which means that I can sort of remember at my teenage years before the internet, which means I grew up, if you will, in a world, in a free and democratic and rich society in which media diversity meant that my parents got the regional monopoly newspaper, so there was only one source of regional and local news. They got one of the national dailies, which in Denmark we were very privileged, and that even in a relatively small country there were 5 to choose from, so you had 5 perspectives. And then you could watch monopoly state public service broadcasting. When I was a kid, there was one television station in Denmark, and it broadcast about 10 hours every day. When I tell my students this, it's not far off the dinosaurs, I have to say. I mean, they find it inconceivable that there was such a media environment in a free country, in a rich and free country. This is really difficult to imagine. Think about my morning today. I'm on the road. I lived in the US for a while, so I often start my morning with sort of flicking through the New York Times app, even though I'm very far away from New York. I know in Hong Kong I could have picked up a hard copy of the New York Times even 20 years ago, probably the International Herald Tribune at the time. But in Denmark you couldn't. I would have had to go to Copenhagen, 60 kilometers away. I would have had to go to the central library, or perhaps on one newsstand at the central station. I could maybe get the New York Times if it didn't sell out, the International Herald Tribune, I should say. So I read that. I live in the UK, so I'll often flick through the BBC News app. Again, in Denmark, 20 years ago, not available. If I'm in a sentimental mood, I can look at my Danish news sources. I have a professional interest in what's going on in the rest of the world, so I'm not saying I'm sort of typical, if you will, but I have friends from my work and elsewhere. So when I open my Facebook app to see what's going on with my social circles, mixed with the baby pictures and the food pictures and the other things that are the most important things, obviously, about my Facebook experience, far more important than anything else, really. There is news from a digital-born startup in India called Scroll. I never go to their website or their app, but I have friends who share content from them. There is news from Quartz. I love Quartz's journalism, but I never actually get around to visiting their site. So if it weren't for the fact that people share it on Twitter and Facebook, I would never see it. And you can all think of more examples like this. I haven't looked at these, but I mean, think of something, just what I've heard from the people I've spoken to since we arrived Sunday afternoon here to Hong Kong. Think about the startup scene here in Hong Kong in terms of citizen news, in terms of Hong Kong 01. I know nothing of these sites, but just think about what an enormous investment of time and effort and money it would have been 20 years ago to try to set up new sources of news. Whether they were volunteer and citizen-driven primarily, in addition to some professional curation, or whether they were primarily professionally based, these things would have been almost impossible. So we have a richness and a diversity today in many, many ways that is unprecedented and really, really compelling. That's the good news. There's also, obviously, a set of challenges. And really, I think the central one, again, and I want to underline here that I think there are other central challenges that are about what some people, even in the Western world, call the war on journalism. It's very clear that there are many actors out there who do not believe in a free press, including in democratic societies, or at least they would like it to be less free and more well-behaved. So I want to recognize that there are many other challenges, but I think one of the central challenges right now essentially boils down to one question, which is who's going to pay? And this, I think, it gets to the heart of the paradox of where the news is at today, is that from my point of view as a user, we live in a fantasy world. It's a fantastic world. It's extraordinary, the opportunities I have, the information I can access, most of it for free, very conveniently. We all have a supercomputer in our pocket. I mean, think about that for a minute. It's extraordinary. But it's a fantasy world in a double sense. It's a fantasy in the sense that it's fantastic, but it's also a fantasy in a rather darker sense, in that right now it's not at all clear what the business model is that sustains this. We are more than 20 years into the development of digital news and investment into digital news by media organizations, and it's still the case for most media organizations that their legacy operations, whether print or broadcast or the B2B sale of content for news agencies, is what sustains their digital journalism. There are many, many media organizations around the world who are still not turning a profit on their digital news operation. This is a real issue. And I sometimes like to say in a way that effectively we're in a situation where my parents' generation are subsidizing my news consumption. Not in the sense that they are giving me money. I mean, you know, they would be welcome to, but that's not the way in which they subsidize it. They're subsidizing in the sense that my parents' media habits are profitable. My parents use media in a way that you can build a business around. They watch television, and their attention can in turn be sold to advertisers. And because there is a limited number of television channels with significant audiences, these advertisements are expensive and profitable for the television broadcasters. They still subscribe, God bless, to 2 print newspapers. That too is profitable. So they pay for the content, and again, their attention is still worth something, though a lot of advertising has moved out of print. That advertising too is still profitable. Now, my parents are in their mid-60s, and they use a lot of digital media. They're not dinosaurs in that sense. They have smartphones, they use computers, they use the internet every day. So it's not at all about them not having embraced digital media. It is that for them, as I think is the case for most people really in rich and developed countries like whether Denmark or Hong Kong, for them digital media is a supplement to routines and habits that they developed much earlier in their life and that they have largely held on to. They may spend a little bit less time with the print newspaper than they did 20 years ago. They probably spend a little bit less time watching television than they did 20 years ago because now they can find things on demand that on some occasions they will go with the programmed content when it's good enough, when it's compelling enough, when it's unique enough, or when they know that, you know, their friends will talk about it tomorrow. But sometimes the schedule is, you know, less than inviting, even with a lot of channels at their disposal. Netflix, there you go. So their habits are still profitable. My habits are also profitable. I pay for the New York Times through my work. My university pays for the Financial Times. So there are elements of my habits that are profitable. Some of my habits are very profitable, but not for news organizations. So Facebook makes money off of me. Google makes money off of me. But there are other habits of mine that are not profitable. So I mentioned that I would see content from Scroll, for example, in India. It's very hard for Scroll to monetize a fleeting moment of my attention on Facebook. I will see sometimes content that my friends back in Denmark will share from newspapers like Politiken or Berlingske or others. Again, very hard for these companies to monetize that fleeting moment of attention. They want my attention because it's better than nothing. So that's why they post their things on Facebook. That's why they let people share it freely. That's why they index their pages on search. But it's quite hard to make money off this news that is free at the point of consumption. The basic issue here really is one of supply and demand. The business models of news, as most of you are familiar with from your own company, was for most organizations primarily based around advertising. Content was important for some, for subscription newspapers, but really it was mostly advertising in most cases. But really, in one sentence, what has happened since those business models were sort of solidified in the second half of the 20th century is very simply one thing. We've moved from an environment characterized by low choice to one characterized by high choice. And really, it's very basic economics. Media technologies change, but economics does not. It's a question of supply and demand. In the 90s, there were few channels through which advertisers could reach audiences. Those who controlled those channels had great market power and could demand very high rates from advertisers. Now, there are many channels through which advertisers can reach their audiences. Prices have come down. Furthermore, some of those channels are offered by companies who sell advertising that is in the advertising industry sometimes called content-less advertising, in the sense that the advertising is primarily served around either OPC, other people's content, could be yours, or around things that are either auto-generated or user-generated. Search results, for example. There are very expensively paid, highly skilled professionals involved in developing search algorithms and running a search engine. But once you have made that high fixed investment, the marginal cost of a search career are very close to zero. And as long as you make some money off the advertising sold around that, you're doing well. So you can sell that advertising very, very cheaply, much more cheaply then the companies that employ most of you can sell advertising. Similarly with Facebook, since most of the content is uploaded or produced by the users, and you don't have to pay those users because they do it quite willingly, indeed happily, you can sell very, very cheap advertising around that. So news organizations in this environment really are in an entirely new economic situation. And I think what's important to keep in mind is that sometimes we see this primarily through the pain of those news organizations who have experienced what in retrospect may look like the good times, 90s, though remember where I started, those were the good times from a corporate point of view. Those were the good times from the point of view of the business side of your companies. Those were the good times from the point of view of the shareholders in the companies that many of you work for. But they were the bad times from the point of view of me as a user. The world we live in today, I would not trade the world we live in today for the 90s that I grew up with and that I experienced myself. I think the world today is better from my point of view as a user. And it's not the good times from the point of view of advertisers either. From the advertiser's point of view, with some qualifications, as we have seen recently, with sort of advertisements placed next to sort of questionable content, the 90s were the bad old days too. From their point of view, today is better, cheaper, more targeted, more efficient advertising. What's not to like? So really the challenge is primarily for journalists. Now I happen to care deeply about journalism, so I think this is a real issue. But we have to remember when we think about it that for a lot of people, the world we live in today is a better world than the one we left behind. So how do we think about the role of journalism in this world that is better in many ways, even though it is very hard for the business model that funds the professional work that most of you do for a living of finding truth and reporting it to the best of your considerable ability? I think really by now we know a few things about what that business of journalism will look like. It will be built around, and you will be happy to hear this, it will be built around what you do. It will be built around great content. And that may seem like a banal thing to say, but we should remember it is not so long ago, the 90s, that the business of media was not really about news very much. It was more about a high degree of control, in most cases, over means of distribution. It was a distribution business. They distributed advertising, and your journalism was actually mostly just a way of drawing eyeballs to that advertising. So really, in most cases, particularly for free-to-air terrestrial broadcasting, and for newspapers in many countries, you didn't think like this in the 90s, but in reality, you didn't work for your readers. You worked for your advertisers. Today, things are changing, and I think we know whether media companies are digital born or whether they are legacy organizations that are trying to deal with a very tough and challenging transformation, that you have to start with the content. That's really the first thing I think we know now. What you need to thrive in this world is you need very distinct content, because there is so much stuff out there that you need to stand out. Now, the tough thing to say here is that we have to remember that the definition of great content lies in the eye of the beholder. So you won't always agree with your audience on what great content is. But I think there is a lot of optimism to be found in the idea that it has to start with content, and that there is a considerable overlap between what journalists care about and what audiences care about. So that is the good news. You have to be distinct and stand out. And this is the case for advertising-supported models, which there will still be in the future, even though the advertising market is challenging. But it's also the case, in particular, as we see a move where subscription and pay becomes more and more important, whether it's in the form of hard paywalls or more sort of metered models that are spreading for many newspaper companies, or whether it's in the form adopted by an organization like The Guardian, for example, where it's not quite a subscription, but a donation model. You're encouraged to contribute to sustain the journalism that you have enjoyed. Contributions from the audience will be ever more important for funding professional journalism moving forward. It's not going to be easy, but I think from your point of view as professional journalists, in some ways, this is a good thing, because you will work for your readers rather than for your advertisers as you move forward. The second thing I think we know is that that's probably not going to be the only source of revenue. So distinct content, starting point, yes. But from a business point of view, diversity, I think, is really the next priority. So we were used to working in a world in which for free-to-air terrestrial broadcasting, if you didn't have license fee funding on the model of, either you pay me or you go to jail, which is sort of the BBC model, which is a pretty robust business model, nice work if you can get it. But for people who have to sort of earn their own lunch, for broadcasting, this was about free at the point of consumption, advertising-supported content. That's the way it worked. Advertising was the sole source of revenue, basically. For newspapers, as said, in the US, it was particularly extreme. There, often newspapers would make 90% of their revenue from advertising and 10% from reader revenues. In Europe, it was a bit more balanced. I don't know the details of how things worked here in Hong Kong, but I think the advertising market must have been very lucrative here till not so long ago in print, just given the economics, if you will, of the city and the businesses here. But those two legs of advertising and reader revenues alone, I think, are not going to be the totality of the business of news looking forward. Advertising is going to be harder and harder because advertising essentially is the business of buying attention, and the attention increasingly is captured by a few large platform companies that are very good at making my life better every day and probably your life better every day through the multiplicity of fantastic products that they offer. They can be slightly frightening sometimes at how good they are at things, but nonetheless we should remember people use them because they like them. So attention is drifting away from media companies, not from news narrowly necessarily, but from media companies, so the advertising will follow. So advertising will be one part, but a less important part of the funding of news looking forward. I said before, and I think firmly we must say for most organizations, reader revenues, whether in the form of a pay model or a donation model, will be one other important source of revenue. And then really we see a lot of organizations right now pushing well beyond that to think of what are all the other auxiliary forms of revenues that we can involve in the with professional news content. We can think of things like sponsored content or native advertising, quite uncomfortable for a lot of journalists, but that's one model that's being pursued. We can think of things like events. Many media organizations are now orchestrating events that are quite expensive to attend, and that is a high margin business. It's not a high volume business, but quite a high margin business if you have a strong enough brand. You have things like e-commerce or merchandising. I mean, these things may seem very far removed from your work if you are out there trying to hold power to account, but at the end of the day, you can only do that if someone pays your salary. However much you care about your job, you will also get bills to pay. So maybe you should be happy if your company can also sell some books through the book review section. Maybe you should be happy if they can also sell some, caps with the logo of your news organization or hoodies or whatever. As long as it contributes to the bottom line, and as long as it's tied in with the brand that you represent and the journalism that you do, it is a good thing. It helps support the work that you do. And it goes beyond some of this. I mean, some organizations are opening event spaces. Some of this does not work out. I mean, every business is tough. There is no sort of promised land where everything works out. The Guardian has had a tough time with its event space in King's Cross in London. But then there are other organizations. This is not sort of hard news, but think about Time Out, the lifestyle and sort of events magazine. They opened a food court in Lisbon, which people tell me now is the second most visited tourist attraction in Lisbon. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's an extraordinary side business to have. So there are lots of different opportunities. There is a woman, Celeste Camp, who works at ProPublica, the nonprofit organization that many of you are familiar with from the US. She has a wonderful metaphor for what her job is there in terms of her work, which is about diversifying the income sources of ProPublica. She talks about how when she was a working journalist, as a reporter, she visited this go-kart factory in Shenzhen that made go-karts for racing courses and whatnot. And when she went there, she was surprised to see that they also produced trampolines. The ones that you might, well, probably not in a city like this. It might be hard to offer your kids a trampoline to have fun in, but more suburban environments, more bucolic environments like New York and elsewhere. We still have space for this in some places. So she was quite surprised. Why do you produce trampolines in a go-kart factory? And the business manager there explained to her, well, it's really very simple actually, because go-karts essentially are made from metal tubes. And when we have produced our go-kart, we have a lot of little bits of metal tube left, and we found that we could fit these bits of metal tube together and produce a perfectly decent trampoline from these bits. So this is the way she sees her work at ProPublica, is to try to think about what are the bits of tube that are left over when you've produced a great news story? What is the insight? What is the data? What's the expertise? What are all the things that you and your colleagues have learned in the process of reporting an important story that you're offering to an audience that has additional value that maybe can be extracted either on a for-profit or a non-profit basis to support further great journalism? So diversity. First, great content. Secondly, revenue diversity. And third, and this I realize, and I say this without glee, but I think this is a fact, much leaner organizations. Many of you already work in organizations that have been through cost-cutting, often rounds and rounds of cost-cutting. Some of you have started your work after some of these rounds and have seen even more of them. But again, as I said, and I say this without any relish, but I think we have to face the facts here, and this is part of also what professional journalism is about, facing the facts, that the revenues that existed in the 90s were a function of a very particular market situation where media organizations had a lot of market power and they don't anymore. And for the majority of media organizations, those revenues will never come back. And we have to face that. I think we can face that. As I said at the outset, media organizations in many cases produce great journalism and even better journalism than they did in the past, even if they have fewer resources. Len Downey of the Washington Post, when pressed before he stepped down as editor and before the Post was sold to Jeff Bezos, was sometimes pushed by his journalists about the consequences for the Post's journalism of the rounds of cuts that were happening at the Post, as they have been happening at many newspapers across the world. And what he said, and I think the fact that this comes from a man whose commitment to professional journalism is beyond dispute, I think suggests that a sort of a kernel, an important kernel to his view that goes beyond what I can say as an outsider and someone who hasn't had to deal with that experience of job cuts. But what Downey said to his colleagues is that he said, look, you know, we may have topped out at 1,000 journalists or so in the Post newsroom when the classified advertising market in the DC metro area was really booming in the 90s, and we had a stranglehold on that market. That was great, and we should be very proud of the reporting we did and the journalism we did. But even after rounds of cuts and buyouts at the Post, when the situation looked really difficult and the Post was stuck in that situation where they couldn't quite figure out, are we a DC metro paper, or are we a national paper, or are we an international paper, and the ownership was sort of in question because the Graham family was still controlling the paper, but it was not clear, what is the future of this company, and Graham was looking for essentially the right kind of buyer to continue the proud tradition of the Post. Even in that situation, when people were really questioning where are we heading as an organization, and there had been multiple rounds of cuts, and I think the Post was down to something like 600 journalists, which is a long way to go if you have within not so distant memory for a lot of people who could remember when there were almost twice as many journalists there. But what Downey would say to them was he would say two things. He would say, first of all, look, this is tough, and I don't like it, and I don't like letting people go, but we should remember that there are a lot of things that are a lot easier than they were 10 or 20 years ago, just in terms of finding information. The Post didn't need to have the kind of library, for example, that they had in the past. They didn't need the kind of librarians and the research assistants. Some of it they needed, but not all of it they needed. There were really great tools. Some of those tools have contributed to the business problems, search, for example, but these are great tools that make your journalism better every day. The other thing that Downey would say is that, look, remember, this paper broke the Watergate story with a newsroom of about 500 people. I thought the paper was great then. Downey worked at the paper then. As you know, he was involved in editing that story. That was a great paper. That was a great newsroom. If they could do great things in the 70s with 500 people, we can do great things in the 2010s with 500 people. So you can do great things with a lean organization. And that's really, I think, where I want to end, which is to say, if you think about how much the business that underpins the professional work that all of you do, think about the extraordinary development in terms of that move from a low-choice environment to a high-choice environment, just how extraordinary that move is. There are a bunch of American academics who have, with sort of the heroic aspirations of good science, have tried to quantify the scale of this change. And it's a very sort of sophisticated analysis, but basically what it boils down to is that they have tried to say, okay, for each minute of attention, so each minute that the average American spends consuming media, how many minutes of content are available to the average American? How many television channels, how many radio channels, how many printed newspapers, and so on and so forth. all of this is very complex, but basically what they argue is that in the 60s we were in a situation where the average American had access to about 80 minutes worth of content for every minute of attention. This is sort of a human scale choice. We can look at 80 options. We do this in the supermarket every day, and we can make a decision. I like that one or that one. And then you have a growth over time, particularly taking off with cable television and satellite television, to a situation in 2005, after 40 years of growth, where the researchers argued that the average American had access to more than 900 minutes of content for every minute of attention. That's a tenfold increase, and that's not a human scale choice anymore. It's very hard. If you go into the supermarket and imagine choosing between 900 brands of beer, you're probably just going to get the same one you got last time. You're not going to actually explore, even if the other beers might be fantastic. You're not going to choose between 900 different brands. You're just going to rely on routines. And what's particularly extraordinary about this figure is that in that calculation, the researchers treated the entirety of the internet as one option, 1 minute. So really, the figure, of course, goes towards sort of infinity, because there literally are hundreds of millions of websites out there that people could, pay attention to. And when you take that into account, as tough as the business environment is, I think professional journalism has a lot to be proud of. I mean, think of any other business in the world that would move from a situation in which they had sort of 80 competitors to a situation in which they had an infinity of competitors and could still command as much attention from as large audiences as professional journalism do today. So this doesn't make it easier, but it gives you a hell of a lot to be proud of. And with that, thank you very much.
To what extent social media, has that become the medium which has become the message because you just live in this your own chosen media environment where you just listen to the same thing all the time?
I think that's one of the defining questions of our time, and I'm really glad that you raised it, because it's a really important one. I mean, there are so many reasons that could lead the algorithms of social media or other platform companies to just serve us more of what we've already shown that we like. In some cases, of course, further reinforced by the fact that at the end of the day, truth be told, most of our friends are kind of like us in most cases. I lived in the States for a long time, got a lot of American friends. I haven't seen an awful lot of Trump voters in my Facebook feed. That reflects the fact that I lived in the Northeast. I lived in a big city, and that I, happen to mostly know people who've gone to college, and many people of color who weren't all that keen on what Mr. Trump had to offer. So I think it's a real concern and a real risk. Here is what I would say. We've tried to look at this precisely because it's so important. And what our analysis suggests is that, in fact, while it's the case that for some people there is real sort of reinforcement effect where there really are these echo chambers, for the most politically polarized individuals, the people who really care deeply about politics and are very likely to choose news on the basis of their political stance and also often have friends who share those views, the issue of an echo chamber is a real one. But what's important to keep in mind is that that's a minority of the population. Most people do not care all that much about politics, and it's other things that drive their friend networks and their media habits. And in fact, when we compare people, online news users, who use social media with those who don't, and we control for other factors like how old they are, their gender, their income, their education, their political views, in fact, those who use social media have slightly more diverse news habits than those who don't. And I think just a way to make sense of this is that for the most engaged, the most partisan, there is no question there are echo chambers. But most people are not like that. And really, I think the comparison for most people is that if they don't use social media, their news habits probably is something like a quick scroll through an app in the morning, what are the headlines, and then maybe watching a bit of TV in the evening. 2 sources. If they use Facebook, if they use Twitter, if they use search, where we see similar dynamics, even if they are served more content from those 2 sources, the one they browse in the morning, the one they pay a little bit of attention to in the evening, they are almost certainly also offered content from other sources. So the echo chamber issue is a real one with partisan minorities, but our research suggests that in fact, for most people, and in particular for young people and people with low levels of interest in news, social media may actually offer a slightly more diverse diet. Not a lot, but a little more diverse.
Thank you. Victor Mann at Financial Times. I mean, I agree with you that the best journalism has never been better. But one of the extraordinary things, and you kind of alluded to this, is that the traditional news outlets, BBC, Financial Times, New York Times, whatever in the West, but also the same would apply in India, you know, the Times of India, the Hindustan Times, the TV stations there, they still seem to me to be the main providers of news. The problem is that that is not monetized as much by those organizations. It's monetized by these aggregators like Facebook, like Google, and so on. And how do you get around that issue of the fact that essentially the content is still there, it's still being read by millions of people, in fact by more people than ever are subscribing to what used to be you know, very dominant media, but they're still very important providers of news. But that is being, the profit, if you like, from the advertising is not being taken, at least not to the extent it was, by those providers of content, even though they're providing better content than ever. It's being taken by Facebook and Google. And I mean, it seems to me that is a kind of problem that needs to be resolved. And how you do it, I don't know, but I'd be interested to hear what you think.
No, I mean, I think this is what I try to sort of to find that right balance, right, when I talk about these issues, that I think on the one hand, from the point of view of many users, and also from the point of view of much journalism, we live in a great world. But it is very clear that there are very real issues with the funding of journalism. And I think the hard truth is that if we define the problem of how can we get back to the revenue model levels of the 90s, then there is no solution to that problem. And I say that without joy, but I think that's a fact. That for the majority of news organizations, there will be exceptions, but for the majority of news organizations, that was a moment in time, it has passed, and one has to look forward and say, okay, how do we make the most of a situation that from the point of view of shareholders and the business side is much tougher and will also often result in cost cutting in the newsroom. Now, I think what I would say is that with most papers of record and most news organizations of record, I'm with Len Downey on this. I mean, I think you can do great journalism with fewer people than you could in the 90s. And I'm not all that worried about whether we will get good coverage of national politics in high-income countries or whether we will get good coverage of major international events. I think where there are some concerns that are very hard to really get a handle on about what is sort of the cost of things not happening, what is the price of not knowing things that we would have known in the past. So there are some of that is about specialized reporting. I mean, even a paper like the FT, I think probably no longer have a Labour correspondent, for example, in the UK, which is an interesting situation. I don't know whether that's, you can correct me if I'm wrong and if there's fake news on that. But of course there are areas that will suffer. I mean, take another area perhaps that's closer to home for me, media correspondence. I think the FT is probably the only paper left in the UK that has a media correspondent. Even the Guardian now is I think, debating the future of the Media Guardian. But the real issue, I think, is actually not that. The real issue is local. The real issue is if you think about, in a country like the UK, who's going to cover City Hall in York? Who's going to cover City Hall even in a city like Birmingham? That is a real issue because there is no clear business model for that. And I think we see some real losses there. So I realize things are tough even at a paper like the FT, though I think many of your colleagues would admire the situation and would hope to have the kind of trouble that the FT has rather than the trouble they have. But I think the real issue actually is elsewhere. Some specialty reporting and local issues.
I mean, it is different for business papers that can monetize their content more easily, like us. In fact, we have more reporters, I think, than we've ever had. But instead of having a Labour reporter, we have 7 people in China, 7 full-time correspondents in China, which we didn't used to have.
Which is great, by the way.
Yeah. Just a quick observation about productivity. You were talking just around the time you were born. I was starting off as a journalist, and half the day was spent. If you were a foreign correspondent, you spent half the day transmitting the story, because you had to send it, you had to type it out, you had to send it by telex. You sometimes had to go to a post office, or you had to write. This was a long procedure. There were no laptop computers, there were no mobile phones.
There were dinosaurs.
Yeah, well, there were dinosaurs. Yeah. But the point is that actually you had to spend half the day actually sending the damn story. And some stories at that time were still sent by post, or telegram. So it's definitely easier to do more. Yeah.
A bit of a follow-on. You talk about lean. One of your last points was lean operation, which is great. If you look at the media in Australia, where I'm from originally, and to the extent of the US, particularly Canada, New Zealand, it's not lean, it's a death spiral. How do you stop the leanness becoming this spiral of failure? The second question I have, which is also very quick, is English language media in countries that are not dominantly English speaking. Obviously the heady days of the Prague Post in the 1990s have passed us, but we do have places like Hong Kong, places like Singapore, where, you know, the media is not, it's not perfect, but it does make money, or it can make money, and there's people who see opportunities for new entrants in the field. Has the Reuters Institute looked at that, and if so, what have they found?
Sure. So first on the second point, overwhelmingly we find that despite the push for global scale by a limited number of English language, normally US and UK-based organizations, in almost every country in the world, people overwhelmingly prefer domestic sources, irrespectively of language. And in fact, if you look at a market like India, where the BBC is currently opening a number of new language services in some of the vernacular languages, that is a very competitive field. And even when you come in with the resources and the brand of the BBC, you know, you're going to go up against really strong domestic players. And whether those are in English, as the BBC also competes in English in India, or in local languages, it's a tough market to get into because people value, you know, they want to hear about the life they live, and that life is still, in most cases, local. So I think there is competition, and of course, whether it's for legacy organizations like the FT, or whether it's for startups like Quartz, you know, once you've set up from a strong domestic market position, whether it's in the US and the UK, it's almost nonsensical not to try to go for that global scale, in particular if you sell your content. So if the FT makes most of their money from reader revenues, the marginal cost of serving an additional reader in Hong Kong is close to zero. So it's free money. I mean, why wouldn't you pursue that scale? Even if you get a limited readership, it's money on the table. You don't want to leave money on the table. So there are opportunities there, but I don't foresee a time in the near future where domestic media are going to be flooded by content from international providers. That doesn't take anything away from the platform issue, where the advertising money is increasingly accruing to a very few US-based, very large companies that serve their audiences and their advertisers incredibly well in ways that legacy media and startups, whether domestic or international, have a very hard time competing with. On the second point about the death spiral, how do you avoid that it's a death spiral? How do you get some traction and make sure that you can sort of retain some altitude here? I don't want to make this sound like sort of a haiku poem, and I couldn't count the stanzas to make it work like that, but basically I think there are only two different problems here. One is if you're a digital-born organization trying to get off the ground, the problem is how do you get big enough, fast enough? So how do you break through in this incredibly competitive environment where the competition for attention is more intense than it's ever been? How do you actually get from where you are to actually having a significant mind share and really building something that you can either sell to, you know, enough people will buy, or advertisers will buy, or other ways of monetizing? So how do you get big enough quickly enough without running out of funds? The problem for legacy organizations is how do you get small enough, fast enough? And that's not the same as disappearing. We should always be very careful not to project things linearly into the future. You know, things are the same until they aren't. These are not linear trends, but there is a real problem of transition of how do you get from where you are to where you want to be, and that's irrespectively of whether you are a legacy organization or a digital-born organization. It's easy to see the successes with startups. You know, the most successful startups are really impressive. Quartz, you know, Quartz broke even last year. That's incredible. 3 years after launch, it's really well done. You know, Jay and Kevin and their team, and it's an incredible accomplishment. But we should remember that there are other startups, and some of them very highly praised, that have gone belly up. Circa was supposed to be the future of journalism, really well-funded startup focused on mobile journalism, didn't pan out. That doesn't mean they were stupid or bad at what they were doing, it just means it's really difficult. So startups are not perfect, and we see the ones that succeed, but we don't see all the ones where they didn't pull it off. And as, you know, again, I don't at all want to minimize how tough the business is for legacy organizations. But again, I really want to reiterate the last point I made. I think a lot of organizations have a lot to be proud of, even if it's not comfortable to go from where you were in the 90s to where you are today. You know, there are something like 1,300 daily newspapers in the U.S. still publishing. You know, more daily newspapers closed in the U.S. in the 60s and 70s than have closed in the 90s and 2000s.
Is print dead?
As a mass medium, yes, no question. I mean, I think, in a way, I think it's really actually very simple to project. If for news organizations themselves, and I think they are looking at this, I think basically what you have to do is that you have to look at your readership, your print readership amongst people between 20 and 30 in your target demographic, and then project that for the population as a whole. That's what print's going to be like in the future, and that's going to be very small. It's not nothing, but it's going to be very small, and in some small markets, it's not going to work for everyone. But there are niches also for younger people in which print serve certain purposes of sort of logging off the screen. You know, if you spend the majority of your waking hours looking at rectangular screens that are backlighted, at some point you want a different experience. You don't want it every day, you don't want it every morning, you don't want it every evening, but maybe you want it sometimes on the weekend. It's going to be a very small niche medium, but you know, it'll be with us in some form or another for a long time, but it's not going to be the mainstream of the business.
If you look at the World Association of Newspapers statistics, the one region in the world that's holding up on print is Asia.
Yeah. Well, let me put a little bit of a different spin on that. I think, you know, what is the problem that a newspaper solves? It's about situational awareness, what's going on in the world around you. It's an aspiration. It shows you are someone who's connected to the society in which you live. It diverts you and entertains you. And it also gives you tools that you need for everyday life, whether it's selling something or buying something or staying informed about fashions and so on and so forth. Now, it's still the case in a country like India, and there are other countries around the world that are in a similar situation, that a very large part of the population have left behind grinding poverty to an extent that advertisers want to sell them a little bit of shampoo and some soap and other products, maybe a mobile phone. So there is a business for a print newspaper. But as soon as that mobile phone that people are selling them is a smartphone, and that is happening now in India on a very large scale, a lot of those problems that a print newspaper solve are going to be solved more easily via digital medium. I was involved in 2 projects we did last year on digital journalism in India, and I had a little sticker on my desk as I worked on those reports with some Indian colleagues to remind myself that every day I spent working on this project, a net 250,000 Indians went online for the first time. This is very, very rapidly changing. And if you look at the industry projections, even from the industry itself in India, you can see English language newspapers, circulation and revenues are now growing. Circulation has basically stopped growing, and revenues are growing slower than the rate of inflation and slower than the overall advertising market growth. There's still growth in the vernacular languages, but in English right now, if you go to the tier 1 and tier 2 cities in India, the environment that younger people navigate in there is not so different from the environment that their peers in the UK or the US navigates in. And Indian newspapers know this, by the way. So there is growth, and again, I mean, as I said at the outset, I've tried to draw sort of a big picture, and it's very, very clear there are very important variations. And of course, there are many parts of India where it'll be a long time before even 3G web is available for most people. But I don't think that one should make too much of those figures from Van Ufferen.
Any other questions? So I'd like to ask you one final one. Mm-hmm. So part of the topic was, you will look in particular at how the Asia Pacific region and Hong Kong.
Yeah, sure.
So just to finish off, and what kind of research will you be doing in the region?
Great. Okay, so we like most other universities for research journalism we're very proud of the work we've done, but we have had some of the same biases that many other researchers have had. We primarily looked at markets in Western Europe and in North America, and they are very unusual in a global perspective. They're unusual in their history, they're unusual in their development and their political situation, so on and so forth. So we have sort of 2 things we're very keen to do now, and it's one of the reasons why I'm here on this trip. We want to do more work in India, so I was glad that you asked that question, and we want to do more work in Asia-Pacific markets, including Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Singapore, and in the future, hopefully, the Philippines and Indonesia, that I think probably in many ways more accurately reflect. We are not right now. I think this is ambitious enough right now for sort of a first wave expansion. But really, I think our markets that in many ways are more representative of what news and the business of news will look like for most people in the world than Denmark or even the UK or the US. So what are we trying to do? We're doing two things. The report we do every year that some of you have seen a hard copy of, and all the data is available on a website called digitalnewsreport.org. Last year we did for the first time a supplementary pilot study where we included Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia to look at media habits here and provide data for systematic comparison with markets elsewhere, to look at the audience, since as I said from the outset, I think we have to think about the audience experience and how this world works from the point of view of the people that you all aim to serve with your journalism, the public's point of view. So that's one side of it. And in the future, we hope to work more towards understanding better both the professional practices, but also the business models and strategies of news organizations that are operating here. What is distinct about these markets? Well, one of the things we learned from the pilot study we did last year was that one of the things that is very clear about markets here, Hong Kong, Singapore, the parts of the Malaysian population that are online, which is a large majority, but far from everyone, is that these markets are mobile first. And that is the way in which the internet will be accessed by almost everyone in the very near future. And I happen to come from a part of the world where we had great telephony infrastructure and could afford personal computers, and therefore we've had this 20 years of a very particular kind of the internet that was based on desktop, on personal computers in the home, and then that experience that you have when you sit in front of a desk accessing digital media on a slightly larger screen. Whereas it's very clear to us that the future of digital news increasingly is defined by the smartphone, which is sort of essentially the remote control for much of our interaction with media. And that development is much, much more clear in Asia Pacific than it is in Europe, because in many markets, not all, but many markets here, there's been a shorter period of desktop internet dominance, if you will. So one is about that, and what's interesting about that is that what the numbers we have from last year suggest is that despite the fear in many Western markets that the game between publishers and platform companies is a zero-sum game, where any sort of advance by one type of actor is necessarily tied to a consummate decline for the other kind of actor. In terms of news distribution, the markets we have looked at here, our pilot study suggests, are interestingly different from most of Europe and most of North America in that platforms, social media companies, and search engines are very important for how people find news in a market like Hong Kong. No question about it. Very, very important. In fact, more important than in many markets in Western Europe and North America. But unlike those who fear that the relationship between platforms and publishers is a zero-sum game, so are news organizations. News organizations online have very high reach. We've seen some interesting examples of new initiatives being launched that are digital and build quite large audiences quickly. And in particular, in terms of the news organization's ability to build relations like email newsletters and mobile alerts, there are some really interesting examples in this region that are ahead, not of every newspaper in the Western world. There are some very good newspapers that are very advanced in this area, but of many newspapers. I've visited the Straits Times in Singapore and also the South China Morning Post here as part of my trip, and I'll visit Apple Daily tomorrow. And in some ways, I would say that these organizations are ahead of many American and European newspapers of a similar size. They are not necessarily ahead of everyone. They may still be able to learn something from the FT in some areas. They may be able to learn some things from the New York Times in some areas, just as the New York Times and the FT can learn from them in other areas. But there are a lot of news organizations in Western Europe and North America that to me seem more petrified by the pace of change than the organizations I've visited here. And I think that's one thing that's really important as we do our research is not only that we want to come here and talk about our work to people who work here, it's also that I believe very strongly that people in Europe and North America can learn from what people are doing here. Whether those are about the startups or whether that's about what Apple Daily and others are doing, I'm bringing things back that I think journalists and editors in Europe and North America can learn from, and that's one of the things we hope to do in the future.
Right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. This is going to be great treats. Coming to the FCC and FCC tie.
Aha.
Which we can vote
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to.